Who would have thought you could put these 8 words and numbers together? Re-releases of Mario games. It's a part of life. Suck it up. I mean, Mario games have been re-released ever since Mario was a thing. But these titles right here, I think, are some of the most iconic Mario re-releases of all time. The Super Mario Advance series. Pretty much Nintendo's excuse for not doing anything Mario related for a couple years. All right, well, that's a stretch. However, yeah. These were our Mario games on the Game Boy Advance. Old-ass titles. Starting with the Game Boy Color, we got Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. This was a remake of the original Super Mario Bros. On the NES. Now, portable, and it is insane. Yeah, it looks just like Super Mario Brothers because it is. And that game, in a portable form factor, in what, like 1999? Let me tell you, that was unreal. I'd never seen anything like it, most notably because I was 2 at the time. But this is still something that I can take a look back at and just be in shock and awe. Portable games at the time looked like this, or at least on the Nintendo side of things before the Game Boy Color. And even on the Game Boy Color, games had that very distinct Game Boy Color stank to them. But in came Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, and it looked exactly like the NES original. But this time it was portable and it had so much extra content to it. It's insane. Even looking at this game these days, the amount of stuff they added to Mario 1 is unprecedented. They had a world map. It's completely unnecessary, but like, why not? I always wanted to see another perspective on grass in the game. Then in addition, there's a bunch of extra little goodies. There's a cool mode, You versus Boo, where it's basically a race through levels. Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels is included, which is pretty crazy. This is just, at the end of the day, a sublime video game experience. The definitive way to play Super Mario Bros. 1, if it wasn't for that goddamn screen crunch. So that's a bit of an issue with console games on portables. To make them fully work, you have to keep in mind these screens are really tiny now. So you have to zoom into your display, or you gotta warp some things around. And because of that, this game wasn't initially designed with an aspect ratio so just crunched up. So there are a lot of moments in this game where it's kind of hard to tell what's coming at you or what's above you or below you because it's so zoomed in. It's not unplayable by any means, and it's something that when you play this as a kid, you don't notice it at all. But playing these days, it is always like one of the most apparent things for me when I'm playing any of these types of games. So that element is really unfortunate, but it kind of comes with the territory, you know? You can't just have Super Mario Brothers on the Game Boy Color. It would look like this. So I understand. But that's really the only major flaw with Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. This remake is so damn cool and set the precedent for future Mario handheld re-releases. Portable systems, in my opinion, have always had more of a kid-like draw to them, as in it's more likely to see a kid with a Game Boy than the big modern game system, you know? Or at least it was back in the day. They were cheaper, and they shut your kid up in the car. Plus, you could play your handheld system wherever. You could play it at home, and you could also play it on the go. You can't do that with a home game system. So, portables, it makes sense why Nintendo dominated this market, and why their portable systems almost always outsold their home consoles. So, let's take a look at Nintendo's strategy here. Instead of making a fully original Mario game for the Game Boy Advance, they decided to go the Super Mario Bros. Deluxe route and just re-release pretty much his entire 2D lineage on the system. Now, of course, that initially sounds incredibly lazy. However, I think this was one of the smartest things they've ever done. Because keep in mind, I grew up in this era. I grew up with these two games right here, Super Mario World, Super Mario Advance 2, and Yoshi's Island, Super Mario Advance 3. Did I know these were older games? Not in the slightest. I was just playing Mario. So you make these games portable for the first time ever. I think that's an easy way to draw in the old fans. Plus, they introduced a couple new things in every single one of these games. Some more than others, but still, it wasn't like an immediate like, oh, they just put Super Mario Bros. 2 on the Game Boy Advance and called it a day. No, they not only put Super Mario Bros. 2 on the Game Boy Advance, but they included all this other stuff in it, making it so then, for for an old-time fan, there were new reasons to play it, and for newcomers, you just don't even think about it. You don't think, oh, Nintendo's just re-releasing Super Mario Bros. 2 again. How much more can they milk this series? No, you're just like, oh man, Mario on the Game Boy, I'll buy that. And because of that, I think a lot of kids who grew up in my generation got that Mario history lesson without having to grow up in the 90s. You played Mario 3, you played Mario World, you played Mario 2, but it didn't feel like you were going back in time to play some old-ass game. Nah, you were just playing your Game Boy. And thus, the Mario Advance series makes a whole lot of sense. So Mario Advance 1 launched with the Game Boy Advance. This is a remake of Super Mario Bros. 2 from the NES. However, they used the presentation from the Super Mario All-Stars version of the game while tweaking it a bit. Enemies are way bigger now in some cases, and they also have voice clips. A lot of voice clips. It's like a pig squealing in your ears the entire time you're playing this game. Now I know some people that do not like this, though I always found it to add a lot more character to Mario 2, just hearing Mario go, I got it! Lucky! It makes it feel a lot less lonely of an experience. It feels more lively now. I understand some people going like, this is too much. I get it, but I don't mind it, and in fact, I do like it. It just adds something to the experience. But I don't have much to say about Mario 2 in comparison to the Mario Brothers arcade game that's included. My lord! This is one of the best things about Mario games on the Game Boy Advance, specifically the Mario Advance series and Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga. They all include Mario Brothers, the original arcade game. Now, I grew up with, of course, these two games right here, and I played Mario Brothers a lot in both of them. And whenever I'd see Mario Brothers get re-released on like the Virtual Console, Nintendo Switch Online, whatever, I'd be like, oh man, I remember playing this game so much, and I'd play it, and I would just vomit. This isn't the Mario Brothers I grew up with. No. This is a fully remade from the ground up version of that arcade game, and it is so good. It's so much better. The original Mario Brothers, I have a hell of a lot of respect for. I think it's a good arcade game. However, I think it's a classic in the sense of like how Ice Climber is a classic. Now stop right there, I can hear that vomit coming from a mile away. Ice Climber on the NES is not that fun to play. However, if you get a hold of the controls, which are very stiff, very slippery, you get the hang of it and you can appreciate the game a lot more. Doesn't make it a great game, but I think it's easier to just sit down and be like, okay, yeah, you know, like I can imagine playing this for a little bit, maybe 10 minutes compared to 5. Mario Brothers is kind of in the same way. The controls don't age that well. They aren't fun. They feel gross. However, that doesn't mean you can't get used to them. You just kind of have to sit down and just live with it for a little bit, kind of learn the ins and outs of them, and then you can appreciate playing the game a little bit more. That doesn't make it great. They're still flawed controls. However, you can make do with them. But the controls in the GBA version are just perfect. Everything is so fast and responsive, and just hitting things from underneath and then kicking them. Just, it feels so impactful, so satisfying. I love all the backgrounds they added, that snowy kind of factory look. Oh man, it's so good. It just feels so cozy. It's so fun to just constantly keep playing the game, just go down a rabbit hole of trying to get your high score. It's just a giant endurance round. Mario Brothers on the GBA is amazing, and it's included with every single one of these. I always thought it was a little weird how like, oh man, you know, the exact same game is included in every single one. No changes, no nothing. But that's because, hey, there are 4 games right here, and you can do 4-player multiplayer with Mario Brothers on here. That's really cool, and makes it so then, if you have Mario Advance and I have Yoshi's Island, it doesn't matter, we can still play multiplayer with each other. An awesome feature, though a bit misleading because all these box arts have this blurb that says, hey, link it up, 4-player multiplayer. Like, yeah, you're not lying, but like when I see that, I assume like, oh man, like Mario World, I get to play with 4 players in that game. Like, no. I gotta be honest, Super Mario Advance, I didn't play a ton. You know, I've obviously played it these days, but this was never my game. What was my game was Super Mario World, Super Mario Advance 2. So yeah, pretty interesting how they start with Super Mario Bros. 2, and then go to Super Mario World. I'm not complaining. I think they wanted to show off a Super Nintendo game on the Game Boy Advance, at least in title alone. Like, oh man, this is Super Mario World on the go. Hey, that was a powerful thing back then, being able to play a game that was only ever a home console title on a handheld in a fairly uncompromised fashion. Incredible. And Mario World is exactly that, a fairly uncompromised version of Super Mario World. This is pretty much the exact same game. The thing with these games is that the color palette is actually a little washed out looking. It's a lot brighter than you'd expect, and that's because, you know, the Game Boy Advance originally didn't have a backlight, so they had to brighten up the graphics on the games themselves to make them more viewable. But man, I played this game all the time. This was one of my major childhood games. And I'm really thankful that it was Super Mario World. Listen, I grew up with a ton of licensed trash. Some good licensed trash, but licensed trash nonetheless. And Super Mario World, it was just a Mario game to me. I didn't really think anything of it, but I played it all the time. Of course, in retrospect, I realized like, oh, cool, that is one of the greatest games of all time. Great. Good to know I didn't grow up with absolute dog shit. Some of the time. Which makes me so damn thankful I grew up with this game right here. But not only this game, Yoshi's Island. I had this one as well, Super Mario Advance 3. It's not even a goddamn Mario game. This one is a bit controversial considering many people don't like this version since the effects just aren't the same. The level Touch Fuzzy Get Dizzy in the Game Boy Advance version pales in comparison to the Super Nintendo version. Or at least that's what a lot of wannabe purists are saying. It looks fine. This version is perfectly fine. I don't understand where a lot of the hatred for this game comes. I don't even think it's hatred. I think it's more so just, oh, that version just isn't the same as the Super Nintendo game. What are you talking about? I feel like some people just want to be labeled as a purist and be like, oh, that's not Yoshi's Island, that's the Game Boy Advance one. Like, yeah, obviously it's the Game Boy Advance version, but like, why aren't you saying the same thing about Mario World, Mario Advance, Mario 3, Mario Brothers Deluxe, any of these? Why is it this one that kind of gets a little bit of like, that's not my Yoshi's Island? This is a solid version of Yoshi's Island. It works great here. Obviously, being on the Game Boy Advance, you have the same problems as like any other Game Boy Advance port of a home console game. But still, it's hard to complain when you're in the mid-2000s, and this is the first time this game has not only been re-released, but available portably. But I feel like Nintendo took the criticisms of all these games, how they're pretty much just the same games, but you know, just a little bit worse to fit on a Game Boy Advance, and use that all to craft Super Mario Advance 4, Super Mario Bros. 3. What a wacky-ass little game this is. Easily the most fleshed out of the Mario Advance series. So Mario Advance 1 had a fair amount of changes and additions, but was still the Super Mario All-Stars version of Mario 2 at the end of the day. Mario World and Yoshi's Island were pretty much the same exact goddamn game. Yoshi's Island had some new levels, but Mario World is still pretty much just Mario World. Super Mario Advance 4 is the Super Mario All-Stars version of Mario 3. Pretty much. Looks good, runs good, has that screen crunch, but I think this is a very good version of Mario 3. However, this version had e-reader support. Now, what was the e-reader? I'm asking that same question. The e-reader was a Game Boy Advance accessory you plugged into the system and you could scan specific cards with it. So then you could add stuff into your games or play specific games, whatever. It worked via the Game Boy Advance, or you could plug your Game Boy Advance with e-reader into the GameCube and use e-reader games and supported games there. It wasn't a very popular accessory, it wasn't a very good accessory, but it was an accessory nonetheless, and some games used it in very minimal, silly, dumb, stupid, dumb ways, but Mario Advance 4 actually used it incredibly well. But that doesn't mean it, I mean, like, that doesn't mean it used the e-reader well. That just means, like, the e-reader support was pretty good. Because the e-reader was always, like, one of the clunkiest, stupidest ass things I've ever seen in my life. You need 2 Game Boy Advances, an e-reader, and a specific Mario Advance for cards. So you have to plug your Game Boy Advance with Super Mario Bros. 3 into another Game Boy Advance with the e-reader plugged in. Then you scan your certain cards into that e-reader, and then you get new content in your Mario 3 game. Now, that content could have been just something as basic as power-ups, but it could have also been brand new levels. This was our original Mario game for the Game Boy Advance. They actually did it, guys. They actually had a new Mario game. It was just kind of hidden here. Of course, the problem is you had to buy a bunch of e-reader cards to get that. And even at that point, I don't even think you can actually store all the levels on this cart. It's like impossible. It caps out after a little bit. Thankfully though, on re-releases of this game via the Wii U Virtual Console and Nintendo Switch Online, they have all the e-reader levels included. And these levels are insane to play through. It's like this hidden Mario game that nobody really knew about for years until the Wii U Virtual Console game came out. Did I mention how all of these games have Mario Brothers? That's it. Like, insane. Like, fantastic series right here. A little strange how, it goes 2, World, Yoshi's Island, and then 3. And then 1 came before on the Game Boy Color, but they also had 1 just basic ass 1, nothing special about it, on the Game Boy Advance via the classic NES series. So like, okay, so we have the entire Mario lineage, everybody. We truly do, because in Japan we got Super Mario Bros. 2, the Japanese version, as in the classic Famicom mini series. So that goes right there. And then on the DS, New Super Mario Bros. Was originally meant to be the successor to the Mario Advance series, like a Mario Advance 5. I don't know how the hell that would have worked. But the handheld launched with Super Mario 64 DS, and the DS had backwards compatibility with the Game Boy Advance. So yeah, you truly had as much Mario that would have fit in your stupid little face. I have a lot of love for these re-releases of the games. Honestly, if I'm ever feeling Mario World and I'm feeling nostalgic, I'll pop in the Game Boy Advance version. This was the one that I grew up with. And Mario 3, I always wanted. I played this game on the NES at my grandma's house when I was a kid, and I saw they had it for the Game Boy Advance. I was like, oh my god! These are all such magical games to be able to play, not only on the go, but as a kid too. And Nintendo's re-releases of these games allowed a lot of kids to play these without having a prior knowledge of like the legacy of these classic games. Because I feel like you kind of need that nowadays. Like the only way to play a lot of these old games is through Nintendo Switch Online, and the only reason why you're gonna open that up is if you're feeling like going down memory lane, see a museum of old farts. But I feel the way they did it back during the Game Boy Advance era was kind of get people to play these old games without realizing they're playing old games. I know a lot of people listening to that would be like, what the hell are you talking about? Everybody knew this was Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island from 1995. But I'm here to say, no, most people that grew up with these games just knew them as, yeah, these are Mario games. I guarantee you, all the kids that played Super Mario 64 DS had no idea this was an older game. It's weird, I know, we all kind of look at these titles and immediately go like, oh yeah, this is a re-release, but that's not the case for most people. And hearing something's a re-release, I feel like kind of gets you to be like, oh, that's not for me. I want to play something brand new. And just calling the first one Super Mario Advance, well, it's a little misleading. It sounds like, oh man, this is Mario's big debut on the Game Boy Advance, and it's fucking Super Mario Bros. 2. But I think that got a lot of people to play some of the greatest games of all time. I love the Super Mario Advance series. I look back at it with a lot of fondness, and I think we have these games to thank for my entire generation having a rough understanding of who Roy is.